Thank you. Well, first of all, I should say it's like an honor and a privilege to talk at this event. The center, Carlos de Villa, and his amazing colleagues have been like a beacon of scholarship and teaching for the whole business history community. They're really role models, and it's fantastic to be here and fantastic to be invited to share some thoughts. So this session is about new paradigms and perspectives, and I'd like to disappoint everyone by praising older paradigms and perspectives. So I think what distinguishes business history from management studies and social sciences is a willingness to engage deeply in the empirical evidence at the past of business, using archives, using other sources. The center's work symbolizes this. And I think in some respects, some of this tradition has been lost elsewhere, particularly people being inclined to write general criticisms of system-wide failures in business systems or capitalist systems. The work that business historians do is labor-intensive, not always appreciated, but I think incredibly important, and a tradition we should keep proud of. So I think it's I don't have to be a genius to observe that the world lives at a time of a convergence of huge crises. And I believe it's the ethical responsibility of business historians to play their part in understanding the role of business in those crises. And as we've heard already in the opening talks, this is something that this center has done a lot of work on in a Colombian and Latin American context. And indeed, understanding the impact business in some way, impact of business in some ways is the oldest question out there in business history. After all, if we think of Al Chandler, his fundamental question was what made the United States rich and the center of innovation in the world. His answer was it was the ability of the United States to create large firms with complicated hierarchies which could innovate. Mira Wilkins, in her work on the history of multinationals, addressed again fundamental questions of so what and impact, particularly when she looked at transfers of technologies across borders. I would like to advocate for an extension of the so what question into areas business historians have been less active in, shall we say. Let me name three of them. First is the environment, the natural environment. The flip side of the Chandlerian Corporation was the creation of businesses which systematically destroyed the natural environment and polluted the planet through excess packaging, all sorts of ways. Since the 1990s, business historians have written about that, but very, very few of them. And it remains an extraordinary limited field in business history compared to the size of businesses' contribution to our current environmental catastrophe. So I think this does a huge disservice. And I would like to advocate for business historians to devote a great deal more of their time to understanding both the damage that business has done to the natural environment and to understanding endeavors within business to do a lot better. Both themes are very, very interesting. Both, I think, are very, very important. Secondly, we live at a time of huge inequality, income inequality, ethnic inequality, gender inequality. Again, that's something that business historians have not completely avoided, but it's hardly been central to any kind of research agenda. And there's a huge range of issues here, from understanding the nature of executive compensation to understanding corporate relations with trade unions, to understanding the recruitment and glass ceilings faced by women and ethnic minorities. There's a huge research agenda there, which I think should be pursued to address the historical development of one of the greatest problems of our age. Thirdly, I think we should look more again at the impact of multinationals. Mira Wilkins wrote about this ages ago. But if you look at the body of literature on multinationals, it's primarily about why and how firms go abroad, organize themselves, comparatively little on the impact of what they do. How were technologies transferred to local businesses? Did they stimulate or crowd out local firms? At a time of growing political support for deglobalization, I think business historians have an enormous opportunity and a responsibility to explore rather more carefully the social, economic, and political impact of global business. Why bother about these subjects? I think, to speak in frank terms, most academic work in business history and in every other subject is read by about 6 other people, if you're lucky. Business historians are working in an area which is central to many of the problems of our age. And so we have an enormous opportunity to both understand the historical dynamics behind those problems and also to make the subject incredibly relevant to management, social scientists, scholars, who often lack the patience or time or skills to look historically, but in my view, are extremely hungry for information and insights that business historians can provide. So we have a world of opportunity awaiting us, I think, if we address the big socially relevant questions out there more. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeff. You are less than 30 minutes, but many ideas, so we can discuss in later after the presentation. So our next speaker is Gareth from Cambridge University. He was there.
Sorry, I was having difficulty unmuting. Thank you. And it's indeed an honor to be invited to address you. And I'm only sorry that I am unable to stay for very long because of a couple of major family matters here. I would certainly have learnt a lot from being able to participate in the whole workshop. What I'm going to do is not really offer a new paradigm, but rather take the framework of the alternative business history that Jeff Jones, Carlos Davila, and I set out in an article in 2017. But within that framework, I want to draw your attention to a number of recent strands of literature on Asia or Africa, which I hope will be of comparative interest to people working in Colombia and elsewhere in Latin America. So the first of these is management education. This very year of 2024 sees two articles published, one in the journal Business History, which has just appeared online by Peter Hamilton, and it's on the adaptation of Taylorist ideas of management by Chinese elites in the 1920s. And the second in Economy and Society, by one of the many scholars named Patel, is about what he calls the making of Swadeshi managers, which is really about management education, or should one say commercial education, in the period 1860 to 1950. And one of the things that unites these two very interesting articles and links it to the framework that we set out in 2017 is that in both cases there was a very strong political agenda. These are both movements to produce better managers in order to develop the economy, essentially for nationalist reasons. The second thing, or second strand I wanted to just mention, but this will be very brief, is continuing work on how firms, foreign and indigenous, sought to make and shape their markets. So I'm thinking in this case of the publication of Douglas Haynes' book on brand making in Indian business. Let me just give you the precise title: The Emergence of Brand Name Capitalism in India. So this follows work on advertising and so on by himself, and also for Africa by people like Stephanie Decker and Bianca Murillo. A third strand requires a jump of period as well as theme, and that is work on the use made of compensation payments received by slave owners. So in the case of Africa, you've got a very interesting article in Business History Review by Everill and a co-author on how in Senegal from 1848, French paying compensation to slave owners and they reinvesting it. So their theme is continuity of capitalism before and after the end of slavery. But you've also got a very interesting paper by Ikama and Ross from South Africa, which is called From Mortgage Holders to Slum Landlords: Emancipation and the Building of Cape Town in the 1830s. In this case, the compensation, interestingly, was received not only by slave owners, but by the people to whom slaves had been mortgaged. So this is slaves as capital, assets as collateral. And this was then used by those individuals to build slum housing in Cape Town. I would just add that there is a lot of current work in Africa on the formation of capital markets. So you've got a very recent book, maybe I can show it, by Marius Lukasiewicz, on the origins of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And my own PhD student, Kofi Ajipong-Boateng, has just finished a PhD thesis on the long road to the Bank of Ghana. And a lot of this is about how far you get local investors and how far institutions were changed or not changed, particularly with the controversies over what kind of central bank was appropriate in an emerging market, and whether they stifled or encouraged local investment. Finally, because I'm conscious of time passing, let me go to a very important theme of that 2017 article, which is the importance of entrepreneurs in Asian, African, Latin American contexts, particularly entrepreneurs mattering more than, say, managerial hierarchies often. And I'm thinking here of a couple of recent books, one of them actually not yet come out. The one that has come out is Joseph Sassoon's book, The Sassoons, The Great Global Merchants and the Making of an Empire. And this is an account of one of the most extraordinary business families ever, I think. Understanding of the opium trade in and from India in the 19th century, but there are also many more positive things that one could discuss in the context of this extremely important recent book. And finally, I think it's fair to draw your attention to a book that is about to appear. This is by A.G. Hopkins, or Tony Hopkins, and it's called Capitalism in the Colonies, Lagos, African Merchants in Lagos, 1851 to 1930. Now, Hopkins is not exactly a young talent. I think he must be 84 or 85, but this is the book that he would have written for his PhD thesis had his advisors not told him that the sources for it surely did not exist. It's a study based on family papers of 100 African traders in late 19th, early 20th century Lagos. And in a way, rather, as Jeff emphasized, it is exactly a story of very labor-intensive, detailed, empirical research, though in this case, with a large number of a large sample. The book challenges the widely accepted view, I would say almost universally accepted view in West African business history, that African entrepreneurs were able to enter the export-import trade directly in the late 19th century once steamships had arrived, but were then squeezed out under colonial rule when European firms extended their operations into the interior. And there may well still be something in that original view, but Hopkins emphasizes the survival of African business as the main force for much of the period into the Great Depression. But also he reinforces something he's argued previously, namely that they were much more risk-taking and innovative than the European companies, who to a great extent concentrated on constructing and maintaining monopolies. So examples of their innovations would be, in terms of product innovations, pioneering cocoa farming in the interior, pioneering the construction industry, pioneering the import and adoption of typewriters and motor vehicles, publishing, and so on. Also very important in the financial industry, and taking the lead in tackling a problem that has remained to this day, to some extent, though to a diminishing extent, in much of Africa, namely the overwhelming predominance of single-owner businesses and the shortage of limited liability companies. These merchants in the late 19th, early 20th century, to a great extent, pioneered limited liability companies in a Nigerian context, just as they also pioneered the annual wage contract. So I emphasize that book as, I think, a very important one, which will be hugely cited in African studies of various disciplines, which is going to be published by Princeton in the UK in July and in the US in November. And I share with you his final thought as my final one too, namely that it's very important to remember that systems by themselves are lifeless. You need people to bring them to life, to operate them. And his story in that sense is rather old-fashioned, but I think very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. You also have been very, very precise with timing. Let's move now to Teresa da Silva Lopez from University of York. Teresa, room is floor.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
All right. So first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for this very kind invitation for me to join in such a special occasion. And I'm really honored to be here and talk about explore new paradigms and perspectives for the discipline. Like Jeff, I have a more colorful view of the future, and I'm going to explore the turbulent life of business history, because I think it has been, this is part of the DNA of the discipline. So I briefly will highlight just that I was looking at the history of business history since the 1920s, when Grass was appointed as the first Isidor Straus professor, and Edwin Gay was involved also in at the beginning of the first Business Historical Society in 1925, and there is a period of high turbulence. So I then started looking at other periods, and I decided to create this matrix, because I thought that there are two clear types of turbulence in the evolution of business history. One is interdisciplinarity, like the start of the 1920s and 30s between Norman Gay and Edwin Gay and Norman Grass, where Gay thought that it should be a subunit of economic history, and Grass did not think like that. Then we moved to a period of 1940s and 50s, where again Norman Grass is fighting or having feuds, as Bob Fredona and has written about, with other scholars, in particular with Cole and Schumpeter, who would end up creating the Research Center in Entrepreneurial History. And then I realized that the period from the 60s to the 1990s is the golden age of business history. Comparative business history becomes the norm. There is a combination of inductive and deductive approaches. Chandler, Mira Wilkins, Penrose, Jeffrey Jones, I think he was in his early days in there, Franco Amatori, and of course Carlos Davila and Maria Inés Barbero. Everybody agreed the discipline developed very fast, and what we see is, sorry, I'm trying to go to the front, is a development of lots and lots of associations during this period, where I thought it was very curious. Of course, we have the original business history conference being founded, the association in 1954. And as I said, we have two research centers at Harvard Business School, which disappear before the 60s. But then in the 60s, we have a development of regional and university associations. And I thought Los Andes was a pioneer, which I thought was very curious. But it's not a pioneer just in teaching, because Apart from Harvard Business School, it was one of the early universities to start teaching business history, but also in research. And I think Maria Inés Barbero has written about this. The name includes the word empresariado, which is a broader view of what the discipline of business history in those days was being looked at, and it included different types of stakeholders, which is a very interesting point that I highlight. So I just 1 minute, since this is about Los Andes and the celebration of Los Andes, I actually think I looked a bit more in depth into the development of the research center, and I thought it was very unique in quite a few ways, because of course this empresariado in their title is a very significant, because it looks beyond the firm and the entrepreneur to include other institutional forms, such as business groups, networks, public-private partnerships. There is research on multiple institutional levels of analysis since 1974, and also looks at different types of phenomena, because it's a country was full of and a region full of different realities from the West, where business history was developing faster. So there is also a credible methodology that is used since early on, despite the issues that have been already highlighted by Carlos Dávila and all the team about the fact that there are not many archives, but oral histories have been a very important and reliable source of evidence for the research in business history. There have always been, since the beginning, interdisciplinary in the research. We've already talked about entrepreneurship, but there's also been work liaising with economics, sociology, and history. And theory and history have been very well integrated to make sense of facts. One point that I think it's quite interesting, and I'll talk a bit more in a few seconds in the conclusion, is that we are now talking about, and Jeff already talked about, the issues associated with grand challenges. But again, Los Andes, because of its unique context in Colombia and also in Latin America, have addressed issues of foreign domination, which I think now are very much associated with issues of responsibility and economic development. We have discussions about the extensive state intervention, and very much related with topics that are now being addressed on corruption, poverty, and inequality, aggravation of inequality, institutional inefficiencies and voids, so important in discussions on emerging markets, and very much connect to the topics that we are now discussing and even teaching: alternative organizational forms, and also the issue of extended turbulence associated with risk and resilience, again, grand challenges at the moment in the world. So what about the 1990s and 2020s? I think Jeffrey Jones and Franco Amatores a few years ago called it the crossroads. I think Carlos Dávila has called it the no man's land. I think Luga Lambos has called postmodernism. There are different approaches, but we are clearly, since the 1990s, after this period of stability where the discipline developed very fast, we can see that there is clearly a period where we have a lot of antagonism in terms of ideologies, in terms of methodologies, and also where there is a discussion where business history should be part of other disciplines or disappear from different types of units and institutions. So it's clearly a period of turbulence, whatever we want to call it. So, but here we have disciplinary turbulence and interdisciplinary turbulence. So I would like to just raise this question: is it possible to develop new paradigms, which is the title of this topic, which will enable to smooth exposure of business history and going back to a period like the golden days of business history? Because now there are clearly pressures for being interdisciplinarity, and disciplinarity can be very risky, especially for the survival of a subdiscipline. Pressure to produce impactful research, in particular in the UK, And there is also a fragmentation of the community in terms, as I said, of methodologies and ideologies. So I would like to just suggest that I think Jeff already mentioned, and I'll just continue that discussion, which is a clear trend, is that for people to engage with responsible topics, to respond to these needs, to have impact, to engage with interdisciplinarity, and in order to combine ideological and analytical differences, because there is a lot of criticism of capitalism, which can make sense, but it needs to be combined with research that acknowledges that capitalism has had its virtues. So, and I think I will just provide you an example of climate change, which is still in cooking, but it's going to be out hopefully this year, which is an attempt that I and a few colleagues have to move forward the discipline of business history by engaging with climate change, one of the topics which is a grand challenge we have in the world environment at the moment, and where there is possibility of us not only extending the discipline, but also to provide relevant information, as Jeff already mentioned in his talk, which can speak to current problems. So what we did here is, of course, if you say, oh, you are not an expert in business in global climate change, and I thought, well, great, this is the aim. The main aim of this, beyond the excellent research that many colleagues are doing, is to actually show that people that are not expert in a particular area have the obligation to move into areas that are of relevance to society, and to maybe, and in this case, we actually combine some experts on the topic, if you look at the names of people involved, the surnames, but also with non-experts in the area, but who are experts on particular industries or countries or topics, and they use their knowledge and their expertise in consulting particular archives or analyzing particular phenomena to expand it a bit more to analyze issues of climate change in the past. And so in conclusion, will there ever be another golden age for business history? I think we need clearly to revisit the boundaries of the discipline. We need to incorporate the grand challenges. Could be one way to do it, because it means adding lots of stakeholders, not just the usual, the firm and the supplier when we look at business history, but we need to look at society and incorporate more issues on gender and so on, but also the role of the government and the environment. The environment needs to become a constant stakeholder now when we look at business, I think. And even when we look at the history of business. Interdisciplinarity, sure, it's great. And in the UK, we have lots of grants for interdisciplinary research, but because business history is a very small discipline, there is this risk of lack of becoming no man's land, as Carlos Davila said, or becoming a subunit of other discipline, which we don't want to lose identity, and also avoid fragmentation and these ideological differences. And then there is also the need to continue building theory of business history. In the golden days and the golden age, we have scale and scope, strategy and stroke, the freestanding firm, and so on. All these concepts that are now being widely used in different disciplines, and sort of they were quite revolutionary, and it's important that we do that in order to keep our discipline relevant for other academic disciplines. And one aspect which is quite controversial apparently at the moment between the different factions of management and business historians is the use of original sources. I'm a great advocate that archival research or oral original sources or oral interviews and so on, they are the distinctiveness of the discipline. That's where other these scholars are very interested in our work, because they use databases or they use much broader kind of sources. So they like the uniqueness of business history in that sense. So I think we need to keep that. And but in conclusion, I just think it's very interesting that when I was preparing this presentation, that I think one of the new paradigms of the discipline of business history is to actually look at what the emerging markets and and researchers like those in Los Andes have been doing, because these are topics that have been analyzed that are important, that they have the characteristics to bring all these differences together, and maybe we can achieve another new golden age for business history. Thank you. And once again, many congratulations and muchas felicitaciones.
Thank you, Teresa, for your presentation. And now let's move to our fourth speaker, Rolf Amdam from Regent Yale School. No, Rolf, are you there? Please, Rolf, go ahead. Rolf, I think you are mute.
Now I'm here. Can you see the
Thank you.
slides?
Yes, thank you, Rolf.
Oh, congratulations with the anniversary, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, and thank you also to my colleagues for 3 very inspiring talks. So I will try to add some words in addition to those, to all the good words that have been said. And I will not so much say much about paradigm, because I think there maybe was a paradigm in what you call the golden age, Teresa. Chandler creating a way of thinking about the society, but that kind of paradigm has disappeared. If there will be a new paradigm, that would be the result of research that has convinced us all of us to think in a new way. So we will see. You may be right in your perspective, Teresa, but still we don't know. That's my understanding of it. My view on business history is related to what is said, among others, by Kipping and his colleagues, when they said that business history cannot truly be characterized as a discipline or a subdiscipline, but rather as a shifting and evolving community, or more accurately, communities of scholars with diverse backgrounds who find a home, sometimes permanently and sometimes temporarily. But that's a good thing. So what I will do is to try to say some word on how I perceive business history as an academic field, and based on that, some perspective for that I think can be relevant to understand business history and the challenges. When I then talk about this concept academic field, I will use the framework developed by 2 scholars, Hambrick and Chen, in that they had in an article in the Academy of Management Review in 2008, where they discussed what are the driving forces that are needed to create an academic field. And they say there are three requirements. First is that the new field needs to differentiate from other fields based on a claim that the core of important problems cannot be solved by status quo. So they solve a new problem. Secondly, they are connected, or they are mobilizing societal resources. For instance, creating of international business as academic field. They benefited for being connected to the creation of the multinational as an example of a societal resources. And thirdly, they need to build legitimacy with a broader community, which means in university. If you fulfill these 3 criteria, then you can say you are an academic field. This has then been studied for the race of scientific management by Hambrick and Chen. Cummings and Cummings have also studied that for the race of organization studies, and said that there are 2 ways to derive this power, or to get this power, and that could be called research capital. You need research capital, or you need educational capital. Myself and colleagues have done a study of the rise of international business, and we argue that we also need network capital. So that's the same. So how could we apply this to understand business history? Does business history fulfill these criteria that is claimed to be necessary for saying that it's an academic field? First of all, I think we can say, when it comes to the first requirement, this question about differentiation from other fields based on a claim that the core of important problems cannot be solved by a status quo. My understanding of business history is that it's been floating between three kind of pillars. One is history, of course, as an overall concept. The other is economics and economic history. And thirdly, a broad set of fields, maybe which we could call management organizational studies, which includes management, organizational studies, international business, at least part of it, strategy, and so on. So in this area, we have tried to, what can we add something that these cannot say anything about? That has been a lot of variation from country to countries and over time. I think if my understanding of this, and I will not give empirical data, is that there are a lot of examples, single examples, for saying that there are some studies that really had added something new because of our methodology and our anchoring. But maybe it's too strong to say that business history as such has been able to legitimize ourselves and show that we give something new that cannot be solved with a discipline. I think that's the challenge. I just address this. When you see this, I think our main strength is that we are strongly linked to history. And I think what we really add, and what is the really good thing with our approach, is the historical methodology. This is what you also said, you, Teresa, and Jeff, is this the historical methodology, meaning the time-consuming research we do in archives, but also the way we interpret this data to make sense of it. Secondly, how have we then been able to mobilize societal resources to build a new field? I think Chandler did it. He mobilized the changes in the structure of the enterprises by studying the rise of larger firms, and this gave him power to create his books and his what then became theoretical contribution to the field of strategy. There have been the globalization as a societal movement have given input a lot of good work on the role of business in historical perspectives on linked to globalizations, and not to forget the anniversaries, which is a societal movement, the anniversary of companies that have been funded a lot of research in business history. I think the question that we need to address is then what are then the societal resources of today and the future that we could and should mobilize? And all of you have mentioned a lot of these things that I mentioned here, and I'm thinking about Gareth Austin's example from Africa and all, China, India, about the role of the global south. And all these things I mentioned here on the slides, deglobalization, climate change, could be that kind of societal resources that could be mobilized to strengthen the position. I'm not so concerned about which, because I think the best thing is then to see how it works. The third thing is building legitimacy with the broader academic community. And building legitimacy is then what you can do by offering good research, teaching, and also this network capital, that you have access to knowledge or something of the societal movements that are going on. And then what's give the field of business history legitimacy today? I think when it comes to research, I think there are a lot of positive things. We have some very, very good journals that are highly respected outside the field, for instance, that we see in the ranking of the journals. But there's not only the big field. It's a picture here. I don't know you know the picture, but this is a picture from a fire in Copenhagen 2 weeks ago, when the stock exchange in Copenhagen burned down. 400 years of history suddenly disappeared. And what happened in that case was that some of our colleagues at the Copenhagen CBS Business History Group, they have done research on the stock exchange, and they were mobilized in the newspaper, in the television, and provided a lot of knowledge to the community about the position of this stock exchange over 400 years. And that, in a way, gave also business history legitimacy to being connected to the real world, not only in the big picture, but also in the close environment. So I think research-wise, we are quite strong when it comes to having this portability to build legitimacy within the academic community. I'm not so sure about teaching. What if we can offer something that others cannot offer, since other disciplines are also developing the methodology to approach empirical questions. And I'm not so sure how much our strength when it comes to networks. While we have a lot of summary and reviews of our research, I think our knowledge about our strength and weakness in teaching in networks is less developed and should be studied in the future. So if we then go back to this perspective, the differentiation from other fields is one requirement. I think one perspective is that we need to apply historical methodology, because that's our strength in the meeting with the society and others discipline, but also to be inclusive. We need to cooperate with other disciplines based on equal respect. And sometimes we feel that, for instance, for those who have worked within organization studies, that there may be some critics saying that they ask a silly question when the reviewer article, that we need to tell how many boxes were opened and meters of document and things like that. But I think that's because we are trained in different traditions in different disciplines, and we need to respect that others had other views. We also need to be inclusive when it comes to geographical studies. I mean, to respect and develop strong ties with research centers in all over the world, and across global north and global south, not only in different countries, but also between different countries, because we may see challenges and problems differently according to where we are positioned. And I think that's one thing we can add to the research. When it comes to mobilization of social resources, I think the main question here is to be relevance, and then come all these topics that you have mentioned about climate change, sustainability, poverty, equality, and so on. But you also need to have a wide understanding of relevance. It need to be relevance to the local community, the area around us, and be open that people that perceive this relevance differently. And when it comes to build academic legitimacy, it's to anchoring the discipline. Academic journals I mentioned, I think they are very good. We have very good editors in all these journals now, which give us high standards in academic communities. But I think our knowledge about how people in Bogota, at Harvard, at Reading, how they work in a way to be able to develop this kind of stable groups over many, many, many years is something that we need to summarize and to generalize more to learn of, because a lot of academic work are done by individuals at universities or business schools, and they may be quite important in some periods, but then they disappear because they're so strongly linked to single persons. Well, why bother with this now? Because some has survived and Bogota has survived. We have a lot of you learned to you, but not only from you, of course. And I think the future of business history is promising, but maybe we should reflect also these things that I mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure to listen to the 4 presentation. I think the 4th of you had been more than careful with the time, so we have plenty of time now for questions and answers, and maybe you can also expand some of the ideas that you present very broadly, because most of your ideas are very inspiring, but sometimes I find very provocative some of them. So I don't know, Rod, can you stop sharing? And please, if you want to raise your hand or write your question in the chat, and Luis Gabriel, you in the room can also raise question from Bogota. Is that okay?
Ask a question, yeah.
Okay.
Roger.
Yes, Roger, please go ahead. Roger, if you want to, I know probably everybody knows you, but if you want to introduce, it would be great for other people who probably didn't know you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me, Andrea?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, hi, Roger Horowitz. My paying job is I'm director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. This is the largest business history archives in the United States. I've also spent a lot of time as the Secretary-Treasurer, now Treasurer of the Business History Conference, going back 20 years. Let me say congratulations to the GHE and also for organizing this magnificent event. This is like a room full of friends at this point, and people I've been seeing over the years and all that. And I think it's a great job not just celebrating your anniversary, but creating this forum for this conversation, this truly international conversation there. So well done. And also, I enjoy seeing my friends develop their ideas in this way. Usually, we chat over a drink or after a very specific paper and all that. So I think it's great there. And I really appreciate the interventions being made here about the range of business history. I'll just say to Jeff, I've been watching what you've been doing at Harvard for a couple of decades at expanding the range of the topics, the fields in business history, doing it from the heart, if you will, of the discipline. I think your books and your students and the things you've done with oral history have been tremendous. And Teresa, Brands, I mean, all this has been really, really, really good stuff there. I just throw in a couple of thoughts to think about. One is, I think, is periodization, which we always like to grumble about as historians. Where I'm sitting, we are in a golden age of business history. We're not out of that. We are in it. And what goes on around in my world is a whole lot more interesting and dynamic and substantial than went on in the 90s. And just looking at data like the kind of researchers who come through Hagley, the attendance of the Business History Conference meetings, all these things, I think business history is doing very well, at least in the world that I am. And I do think elsewhere, outside, looking at the presence of the scholars here. So maybe just because I'm a glass is always half full kind of person, I think that we're doing very well. But here's my thought for all of you. I think the key there was actually getting rid of a paradigm and not having a paradigm. And I want to question whether you really want to focus on creating a paradigm, or are you looking at expanding the range of questions? And I think those are different creatures. I personally think paradigms can kill disciplines. And I'm not just thinking of business history, but other disciplines that I have had a chance to watch on, because it limits the range of methodologies that people can use. Paradigms structure the way arguments should be made. It structures questions in a way that can keep people out. And I've seen this happen, especially in places like family history, labor history, contemporary is trapped in having a paradigm and all that. And I think what makes business history so vital is we have multiple paradigms that people can borrow on in different ways. The Chandler approach, I think, is still very powerful as a shaping device. And frankly, I encountered plenty of people from outside business history who come to Hagley and discover the Chandler understanding of the firm and the nature of divisions and things like that. But it's not the only paradigm involved. One of the things that happened in the 90s was Phil Scranton and others pointed out that the Chandler's big businesses were a significant minority of the large number of firms that were out there. And there are other ways of understanding phenomena in our society that required letting go of the Chandler paradigm. And if we held on to it, there are things that we weren't going to be looking at for that reason there. So I would say that there's a difference between doing what I think is expanding of topics and questions, which I see as Jeff and Teresa's talks there, and paradigms. It's worth having multiple paradigms. It's worth thinking about methodology. We all should think about methodology. We all should learn from each other about different ways we do that. But I would question the value of finding a new paradigm. I would value finding different paradigms, plural, in which you look at the world and perhaps thinking about these in a, if you will, a friendly sort of way, as ways of going about things. So that's really my thought about it. I think the questions you want to raise, I mean, all for that. Making business history engage with the challenges of the world means we will be able to talk to more people. So I'm all for that. So thanks. I'll stop.
Thank you, Roger. You made a question for the 4th. I don't know if any of you wants to answer Roger reflections and question. I know maybe Teresa, because you are the one who proposed that that prioritization. Also, we have a question by Alvaro. I don't know, Alvaro, if you want to write your question, or I can read. I don't know. Alvaro, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. This was a question that was raised by Raul's presentation, excellent presentation. I didn't have possibility to attend earlier, so I didn't hear every presentation. And the question that I'm asking, not only Raul but the other members of the panel, is how you define the historical methodology? Because as you presented the historical methodology as the anchor, as the basis of business history differentiation, how do you define it? Because we can think about the archival sources and work with archival sources as one definition. I think that is not enough. Another possibility is the emphasis on time and process, and I also think that is not enough. And the last is the contextual approach. So how do we define the historical methodology?
Thank you, Alvaro. I think we have two questions here from the Zoom, and give you the space for Teresa, Jeff, Rolf, or Gareth to answer that question, and then we can move to the room. I don't know if there are any question, but let's first discuss two very broad and very interesting questions that have been raised by Roger and Alvaro. I don't know who wants to start. Teresa.
You want me to? So shall I share again my, I just want to show the evolution of the associations, just to say why I call it thank you for Roger, by the way, for the questions. And and I agree with your points. I think they were very well, they were good, very useful remarks for the discussion. Let me just highlight 2 points, 2 things, and I'll just share 1 minute the screen just to see, explain a bit. So the first point I wanted to highlight is, if you notice, I put the 1990s, Roger, in 2 boxes. So the Scranton work comes into the top, interdisciplinarity and disciplinarity turbulence. So it's when critical analysis emerge. What I'm not saying the golden age is the best age. I'm just saying the golden age. And so I agree with you. The current age can be very dynamic and can be amazing, and all eras have their role. What I'm saying is, in terms of feuds, it's an era with there's lots of agreement, and this is very clearly illustrated by, sorry, where is the slide? Yeah, as you can see, before the 50s, we have only Harvard Business School developing research centers. From my quick research in terms of the evolution of research centers, the green ones are the national. So we have, Japan and Business History Conference are very early. And then I removed the economic history associations from these analyses. And Los Andes is clearly a pioneer. And I think it's very interesting that we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of this association, where, this year we also have the BHA celebrating 30 years, and in Europe, so much more young. And another interesting evidence is, so this period, there is a lot of development of the most important research centers. And as Rolf mentioned, they are very much associated with particular people. And when those people go, the research centers often don't survive. And we can see LSE, we can see Reading, the Center for International Business History. Of course, they have a very important group there, but again, merged with other research centers because of this pressure in the UK for interdisciplinary research. But then we can see that after the 90s, very few centers started being developed in the areas. So that's the point I wanted to make, is that I agree with you that the golden age is not the, and when I mentioned the golden age, I'm not talking just about Alfred Chandler. I'm also talking about Miro Wilkins and Lou Galambos and Franco Amatori and Carlos Davila and Maria Inés Barbero and all these other researchers. Or there is a common, and Patrick Fridenceau, but Patrick Fridenceau is also in the other box of the post-1990s in the critical study. But the thing is, what I'm trying to say is there a period where everybody's interested in using analyzing similar phenomena. There is no need to there is less noise in terms of whether the discipline is developing on its own or does it need economic history. There are less fights in this period apparently, and then we start the 21st century with lots of critical analysis and especially disciplinary. And that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying for the discipline itself, it creates a threat. So of course, Hagley, it's great, but in other parts, it might be that there's fragmentation and lots of other associations and other things, other initiatives emerge separately with even smaller groups. I don't know. I leave it to the group here to consider it's a good thing or bad. But it was my thought for this discussion.
Thank you, Teresa. Jeff, please.
Just yeah, I think I pretty much agree with Roger about the problem about paradigms as more likely to subdue conversations than anything else. I think a central problem is not the lack of paradigms, but a kind of lack of central questions in the discipline at the moment. So there's a lot of people doing many things, but very few. There are central questions lurking. In the United States, how far was slavery fundamentally responsible for industrial capitalism, or as Gareth talked about, how far is the business history of emerging markets different from that of the developed West? So there are questions lurking, but I wouldn't say that they are, dominant. There's lots of people doing many, many other things. Does that really matter? I think it matters in an institutional context that we see at the moment across systems. Small subjects are squeezed out by large disciplines. It's very, very, very hard for small subjects, not just business history, but other small subjects, to keep their positions within institutions. And one issue is, and I've been asked this at Harvard Business School, what are the key central issues of the discipline? What is everybody debating? And it's not particularly easy at the moment to give a sensible answer to that. So that's kind of what concerns me. I'm not concerned by the lack of paradigms. I'm concerned that there's a discipline that's kind of all over the place and not asking, debating central questions. And I think those central questions can and should be debated by lots of methodologies. That's a strength of business history, that multiple methodologies can be applied, because we're not straitjacketed to some social sciences. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Rolf or Gareth, do you want to react to this question? We also have Patrick Fridenson have raised your hand. I don't know if Gareth or Rolf. If not, we can. Rolf, you have.
I can.
Yes.
I can make some comments. I think I agree with all of what you said, but the fact that small subjects are squeezed out, I think that's very, very important. And that's why I thought it important to summarize those who have survived over so many years, how it may manage to do it. I agree that it's important that we are able to give good answer to the question what we are debating, and then also this big questions about global climate change and all this are mentioned. But the fact is that there are several disciplines that mention the same. And in this picture, I think that our strength then is that we have the historical methodology, that we can add something by offering that. And to Alvaro's question, how would I define historical methodology? I will not define it because it's complicated, but it's important to define. It deals with hermeneutics, it deals with source criticism and all these things. But what I want to underline is that this meeting with other disciplines over the last 10 years, organizational and management studies, has improved our historical methodology, because they have challenged us. They said that we don't state our methodology, we take it for granted, and we had been forced to be more explicit on the methodology. And I think that's a strength that also have built legitimacy versus some other disciplines.
Thank you, Roel. I don't know, Gareth, if you have any reaction to this question? I think you are mute.
Yes, so again, having difficulty unmuting. Just a couple of thoughts. One is, I agree that to have a dominant paradigm can restrict the conversation. I mean, we can see this in economics, where if you do not use these particular methodologies, your chances of getting published in one of the accepted few top journals is nil. And that really matters, because your chances of getting promoted as an economist depend on publication in those journals. So I think it's actually an advantage not to have a dominant paradigm, though to have rival ones is certainly helpful, as long as people are still friendly. Second point I'd make is looking at this from the perspective of African universities. I think African universities really lack an institutional center for business history. You know, I can think of individual scholars, but one of the most striking things is the contrast between the proliferation of schools teaching business in various forms. There are any number, particularly of private schools set up over the last 30 years since economic liberalization, that teach everything from quite basic skills to quite advanced ones. But as far as I know, no business or management department in Africa actually teaches or encourages research in history. And there is a lack of focus on what Jeff called a central question. So in the case of African business history, I would say one of the central questions ought to be, why is it that businesses have rarely outlived their founders? I mean, there are exceptions to that, as Ayodeji Olakoju of the University of Lagos has noted, and others have made similar points. So it's certainly not an iron law. Nobody suggests it is. But I would say that is a very important question, which would raise lots of questions for people teaching management or teaching business, and yet it's lacking. So I don't have an answer as to exactly why that is, but I would think that's a major gap in Africa compared to, for example, Latin America.
Thank you, Gareth. I think maybe we come back to the institutional issues. I don't know if any question in the room. If not, I will give the chance to talk to Patrick.
Not so far, Andrea. You can go ahead.
Okay. Patrick Fridenson.
Well, first, it's my turn also to add my congratulations for these 50 years, and to thank both Carlos and Maria Ines Barbero for having given to our French journal Entreprise et Histoire a large and great issue on Latin American business history, which is very influential. I want first to add one topic to the list of expanding questions, which is simply war. I mean, war behind us, war among us, in terms of war that we watch, that we feel, that is created dramas and crises. But all wars are matters of businesses. And this is a topic which may not be a matter of consensus, but which I want to add to these questions, and which is also war in every continent I can think of and between continents. Second, looking at my personal experience, which is in a way typical of French experience, I was trained in a relationship between business history and economics. If I look at today, most of the relations, interdisciplinary relations, are no more with economics, I have to say. They are either with anthropology, which is very important to understand how people behave, how institutions think, to quote Mary Douglas, and how people are learning or forgetting. And the other is sociology. So the types of interdisciplinary relations vary not only from generation to generation, but also from country to country, or from field to field. And third, I think the field is deeply transformed today by two ways. One is the amount of sources which are available on internet. Every day, internet archives, other institutions, national archives, local archives, and parliaments, governments are adding printed sources. I see colleagues, Phil Scranton, who has been mentioned by Richard, but also see colleagues who are writing on the history of nuclear business, who are reading thousands of pages which are now available of internet. So the conditions of work, even on historical method, working on documents, are deeply transformed. And this is something which we have to think about as a challenge, and it is a major source of development. And the other thing is the quest made by the medias, that is television, internet, radio channels, are asking colleagues for business history every day in my country. And it is also changing the relation that we have with a larger audience and the relevance to society. It's not at all sure that government or public administration thinks of business history, but it is true that the medias are using historical resources and sometimes business historians. And finally, I want to mention the fact that we are a field which has been changing, because it was white male field when I began. My colleague Michel Perrault, one of the founders of social history in France, when she asked to do a PhD, wanted to work about women, and her supervisor, a well-respected man, Ernest Labour, said, "Madam, that's not a topic. You should write on strikes." Think of that. Think of the work we have now. So we are transforming ourselves, and this is part of the things I wanted to say to contribute to this international and Latin American discussion.
Thank you, Patrick. And also, it's very much connected with the question that Mary Yeager did in the chat. I don't know, Mary, if you want to talk. If not, your question is, why has business history shunned feminism? Why has feminism not engaged more with business history, issues of responsibility and accountability? So I think, I don't know if you want to react to what Patrick have said about how this crossing disciplines and now about these issues of feminism and engage more with feminism. Paloma, do you want to add something to this discussion?
Yeah, simply completely agreeing with all of you. I believe that some small important element is missing here, which is a big actor in business history, which is the time that researchers have to do research, write, and publish. And the time that in the golden age that Teresa has identified, or before the golden age, the time that researchers had to go to archives, read, think, talk to colleagues, and visit. It was so enormous. It was years. And I remember some of the biggest scholars that I read, Carlo Cipolla, or the big ones, Rondo Cameron, when I was a student. They spent years before they wrote a small book, which became so influential that I think that we should be aware of how much time we have, how much time our students have, how much time our reviewers have, or how much time journals give people to publish. So I think that time is shrinking. As Carlo Cipolla said, he said very well that one of the key actors in history changing has been time. And the less time we have to do research, probably the less good paradigms will emerge. I think that we need time. And these workshops may give us some time to think, but we still have a lot of class notes to prepare, exams to correct, quizzes. Our students are pressed to do a PhD in 2-3 years and publish 3-4 papers, 1 per chapter, and maybe they have 3 months to research and send to a journal. So it's crazy. I think that we cannot have decent paradigms if we don't have time. So maybe we are here, several editors, maybe publishers, and I think that we should start rethinking issues about time. As professors, as members of committees in ministries of education, when we have given accreditations to institutions. So we are, in a way, we have to do some self-criticism because we are contributing to give less time to do good paradigms in business history. So that's only one more ingredient to the complexities of the analysis.
Thank you, Paloma. Actually, Paloma will participate in the last panel about the challenge. So where you can raise again that critical issue of time. So I don't know if you have any reaction from what I have heard so far, Jeff, Teresa, Christina is there, but I don't know, before giving the voice to Christina, any reaction from Teresa, Jeff, Rolf, or Gareth about what you have heard?
I'm just answering. Paloma just made me laugh with the issue about the compression of time. I agree, but what I thought, and I agree with this view that we don't need one paradigm, we need multiple paradigms. I think that's also the question of this raised in this session. But what I found very interesting in this, in preparation for this talk, is that actually one of the paradigms is done for us, the emerging market research on these issues that are now the global challenges have been done for decades in emerging markets, because the global challenges to somehow have been issues of deforestation, colonization associated with exploitation and government and corruption. So all these issues that are now associated, climate change and so on, there, to some extent, there is a micro environment in the emerging markets where that research has for many decades been very different from what the West was analyzing. But the Western countries were analyzing, the evolution of capitalism and the growth of the firm and so on. But actually, these topics are now very relevant. So in that way, this puts emerging markets quite in the center of the discipline. And Los Andes is, I think it's a very good moment to be here. I'm saying this because it's a celebration, but actually, I think it's true. I realized in the process. Going back to Mary, which I always love the questions about the role of women, and I think it's great. I think I agree. When we need to take the new stakeholders, we can't do research where I was talking about society, and I think Jeff has this new book on responsibility of business and gender, not just women, but gender and issues need to be addressed very clearly when we look at the company's archive. Even if they are not the central topic, they need to be taken into account, and also the issues of the environment in general. They are becoming, so there is a part of unexploited parts of the archives, or maybe not even information available, but there are areas that need to be addressed if we want our research to be relevant for the rest of the world in the present day, which is a kind of a new demand that at least in business schools that we have.
Thank you, Teresa. Cristina, and then we'll move to the room there in Bogota. Cristina.
Do you want to go to the room? Oh, okay, I'll make it really quick. I just, this entire discussion, I can't disagree with any of it. I am also not starving for a new paradigm, and I think the plurality of methods is a real strength of business history. But in one of our meetings here in Copenhagen, Per Hansen mentioned recently that we're slowly slithering into a succession crisis. And I wonder how colleagues around the world feel about that, because it does, at times it feels a little bit like we have a really strong community and there's something really valuable being developed within that community, but it's not obvious to me that it actually translates into the next generation. And even just looking around the room, I mean, this is a really good conversation, which we're probably not going to have again 30 years from now, right? I mean, because there is a certain demographic to it. And so I wonder if the responsibility of business history as a field is also to put more emphasis into education and helping, like delivering craft skills to new people that could very easily get lost in all the time pressure that Paloma is mentioning, and may also relate to some of the challenges we have had in clearly articulating what we do as historians and why it is so valuable to society. So I wonder how people feel about that. Maybe that's actually a false perception, but it is something that has been kind of lingering in my head ever since Per said it, and I know Per is in the room as well, so he can contribute to that maybe.
Great question. I would love to hear what our colleagues have think about it. And then we'll move to Bogota, to the room. Luis?
Should I ask my question now or should I wait?
You're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I think we can put the two questions and then open the room.
Okay. My question is about concepts. So we're talking about new paradigms, and I was thinking about concepts. So I wanted to ask the speakers about the concepts of global south and emerging markets. And I've noticed that in social and cultural history, those are not terms that are very much used. So I wanted to ask them why, in the case of business history, those are very popular terms. And at the same time, in which ways is it useful to use them? And in which ways, perhaps, it's not very useful to use them?
So we have two great questions. I don't know who wants to take some of them. And everybody's also invited to reflect on these issues as well. Since I think Cristina and with Luis Gabriel have said are very broad questions, and everybody can have a position on that. So I don't know who wants to start. Jeff, you are now writing about these new emerging markets or etc. What's your approach?
Yeah, I'm writing a book about the global history, business history of the global south. And I use it, I use it, and I'm very explicit about that. I use it as shorthand for Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And I, among other things, are very explicit that it's a very fluid concept. I mean, it's clearly geographical nonsense, first of all, as most of the global south is in the northern hemisphere. And actually countries come in and out, if you like, of the non-wealthy part of the world in quite interesting ways. So I use it as a dynamic and fluid organizing principle rather than some sort of rock hard issue. I think the problem of the new generation is enormously challenging because of this squeezing of business history by bigger disciplines. And so making the case for doctoral students and postdocs in many contexts is very, very, very hard. And I think it's the most important thing out there. And I think it's very hard to achieve. And that's absolutely the story at Harvard Business School. So, yeah, you're right to identify that as a huge issue. And I think we need to somehow try to think about some ways we can do better than we are at the moment. I mean, there are a lot of young people going, say, to the Business History Conference and to the EBHA, but their career paths are not so certain. How a lot of them are going to get knocked out of the whole story, and that's just very worrying.
Thank you, Jeff. I completely agree with you that this is a huge challenge for the future, and we should start discussing this more properly in many different congresses. I don't know, Gareth, if you have any question about this Global South, because you are an expert on African business history, how you are feeling about using that categories, meta categories.
I wasn't an enthusiast when the term came in, partly or mainly because of the geographical absurdity that Jeff mentioned. I mean, New Zealand, Australia are quite far south, and it seems absurd that they should be excluded from a term which is half south. But of course, it replaced third world, which perhaps made sense as a shorthand with lots of qualifications during the Cold War, but doesn't really make much sense later. So you could write an interesting history of the of the third world as a period in history of particular parts of the world. But that period doesn't include the present. So I do use Global South a lot for purely pragmatic reasons. Emerging markets obviously carries the risk that, what do you say when markets are depressed? It's a slightly optimistic term. But again, roughly speaking, we know what we mean by it. So I do occasionally use it, though less often than Global South. But if somebody could invent a better term, I would be very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. I agree with you. We have only 2 minutes left before our first break, but I want to share, I don't know, Connie, I think Connie Cardenas, who's a colleague from Los Andes and actually a pioneer in women in business. So I'm glad that she has joined. And Connie said in the chat, congratulations to all the members of this group and to Carlos Davila and his pioneer task and his persistence and commitment to pursue this mission of making business history relevant and attractive to students that frequently see history as a subject of the past. So I think this is a thank you, Connie. And I don't know if any question, comment in the room, Luis?
No.
Because we have only 1 minute left, but if someone has something to say about teaching, because I think Rolf have mentioned about legitimacy, and we have been discussing about the role of business history and what that means to be a business historian nowadays. But institutionally, Gareth said that in Africa, there's missing these sort of centers. So, but how important is teaching when we thought about the future of our discipline? What do you think? Because in many, many centers, there is a huge discussion about, taking out our courses.
Andrea, just before we proceed, we have one last question here in the room.
Please.
Yes, just an observation. I have listened that one of the topics is climate change. But I think that this is a very restrictive way of looking to it, because we are talking today of global change and or the environmental crisis that is with the climate change, biodiversity decline, chemistry contamination, and so forth and so on. So that I think that business history has to tackle the point with a wider view. Very restricted to talk only about climate change.
Thank you, Manuel.
Thank you, Manuel. I don't know if you have any brief reflection on that. We are just,
You want me to say something, Andrea?
if you want.
Nice to see you, Manuel, and thank you for the point. I was just using it as an illustration of topics that are of grand challenges of today, and climate change is possibly the most important grand challenge that we have. But there are many other topics that have been mentioned here, which I think are interesting. The general view is that business history, and I'm not the first person to say this, at the moment there is a pressure for business history to be relevant, to speak to current problems. And so I used climate change as an illustration, but I agree there are many other topics that business historians should be in research, and they certainly are. Thank you.
Per, do you have any comment?
Yeah, it was your question about teaching that kind of woke me up. I happen to think that much of the research we're doing, which is published in journals and increasingly must be published in journals, is, if not irrelevant, then not interesting. Nobody reads it, and it doesn't really make an impact in society at large, and that's deeply problematic. In contrast, I do believe that teaching is very important. Not necessarily that it'll change society, but I think that teaching history in a business school, and I teach financial history among other things, but I don't teach about efficient financial institutions. I teach Jeff's case on Kruger, I teach Enron, I teach financialization, finance, capitalism, power, and so on and so forth. And in a way, I think it's one of the very few opportunities we have to teach business students, please do no harm out there. Because if they enter the market and companies with this idea that it's all about finance, it's all about greed and so on and so forth, we can be a counterweight to that. We can tell them that context matters. We can tell them, try to make them to get a much bigger picture and to be critical of what they are doing when they go out in society, and being critical about many of the topics that Jeff raised, which I very much agree with him about. The other thing is, as Rolf mentioned, one of our, Christina and my colleagues, Anders Ravn Sørensen, has been in media all over the place, even in BBC when the Danish Stock Exchange burned down. And many of us are mentioned in the media, in national media in Denmark quite often. And I think that's another way to do an impact that may actually be more important than writing articles that nobody reads.
Thank you, Per, for your answer. I also agree. Let's now stop and have a brief break. No more than 15 minutes to start with our second panel. We're moving to Latin America, business history and the contribution of the group. And remember that also we have a third panel that will be thinking ahead, making relevant business history. And I think most of these issues will probably be back in the discussion. But let's take a 10 minutes at least break, and the session will remain open. But hopefully you see all in 10 minutes so far. Thank you.